Do you really know what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, or was the true history of these cities never told? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the Bible's best-known accounts, but what we've been taught about it is just a simplified version, distorted by interpretations over the centuries. In today's video, we will unravel the mysteries behind the destruction of these cities and explore the layers that many prefer to ignore. Does Sodom and Gomorrah's sin really boil down to homosexuality as many believe? Or is there a much deeper story, with lessons that can transform our vision about society and human values? To bring you this comprehensive analysis, I've spent months studying ancient Hebrew texts, examining archaeological evidence from the Dead Sea region, and consulting with biblical scholars. I've cross-referenced multiple historical sources, including the original Hebrew manuscripts, ancient Middle Eastern historical records, and modern archaeological findings. This isn't just another retelling. This is the result of extensive research and scholarly investigation. In this video, let's look at the historical context, the messages hidden in the scriptures, and especially what the Bible really says. Get ready to be surprised at the true story of Sodom and Gomorrah that no one told you. By the end of this video, you'll not only understand the real reason these cities were destroyed, but you'll also gain insights into timeless principles of justice and society that are more relevant today than ever before. Stay with me, and let's dive into this puzzle that has fascinated and caused reflections in every corner of the world for millennia. Sodom and Gomorrah, a paradise more wealthy than Egypt's pyramids. To truly understand the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we need to transport ourselves back to a time when civilization was still young, to an era when cities were rising from the desert sands of the ancient Near East. Picture yourself standing at the southeastern edge of Canaan, near what we now call the Dead Sea. The year is roughly 1900 BCE, and before you lies a landscape vastly different from the barren wasteland we see today. In those days, this region was known as the Valley of Siddim, described in Genesis 13:10 as being well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Imagine a fertile plain stretching as far as the eye can see, dotted with date palms and agricultural fields, where two gleaming cities rose from the landscape, Sodom and Gomorrah. These weren't just any cities, they stood at the crossroads of the ancient world. To the west lay Egypt with its mighty pyramids and powerful pharaohs. To the east stretched the sophisticated civilizations of Mesopotamia with their ziggurats reaching toward the heavens. And right here, in this strategic location, Sodom and Gomorrah controlled a crucial trade route that connected these great powers. Archaeological evidence and biblical accounts paint a picture of extraordinary wealth. The cities were known for their abundant natural resources, bitumen pits that provided valuable building materials, salt mines that supplied this precious preservative to distant lands, and fertile soil that yielded bountiful harvests. As Genesis 13:13 tells us, "Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. Yet their material prosperity continued to grow." But wealth wasn't the only thing that set these cities apart. They were part of a confederation of 5 cities known as the Cities of the Plain, which included Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, later called Zoar. These cities had already survived one major conflict, described in Genesis 14, where they fought against an alliance of 4 powerful kings from the east. This battle, known as the War of the Kings, demonstrates just how significant these cities were in the political landscape of their time. The archaeological record reveals something fascinating. The region around the Dead Sea shows evidence of advanced urban planning, sophisticated irrigation systems, and impressive fortifications. These weren't primitive settlements. They were advanced metropolitan centers that could rival many of their contemporaries in technological achievement and cultural sophistication. Yet beneath this veneer of success and sophistication lay a darkness that would ultimately lead to their destruction. The very wealth that made these cities great became the source of their moral corruption. As the prophet Ezekiel would later write in Ezekiel 16:49-50, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy, They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Consider the irony. These cities that sat astride major trade routes, cities that should have been beacons of hospitality to travelers and merchants, instead became notorious for their mistreatment of strangers. Their wealth, instead of being used to help the less fortunate, became a source of pride and moral decay. Their sophisticated culture, rather than elevating human dignity, became a facade hiding systemic oppression and violence. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic episodes in biblical history. These cities, blessed with natural resources, strategic location, and material prosperity, stood at a moral crossroads. Their response to divine visitors would soon reveal the true extent of their corruption, and their fate would serve as a timeless warning about the consequences of moral failure in the midst of material success. But before we delve into the events that led to their ultimate destruction, we need to address a crucial misconception that has colored our understanding of this story for centuries. The popular interpretation of Sodom and Gomorrah's sin has focused almost exclusively on one aspect, while missing the deeper, more complex reality that the Great Sodom Deception, why everything you know about this biblical story is wrong. When we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, most people envision a familiar tale, one that has been passed down through centuries of religious tradition. Picture, if you will, two prosperous cities beneath a blazing Middle Eastern sun, their markets bustling with traders, their streets lined with impressive buildings. But beneath this facade of prosperity lay a darkness that would become legendary. For generations, religious teachers and scholars have painted a particular picture of these cities' sins. The traditional narrative, echoing through countless sermons and Sunday school lessons, focuses almost exclusively on sexual misconduct, particularly homosexuality. This interpretation has been so deeply ingrained in religious consciousness that the very word sodomy entered our vocabulary as a term for sexual deviation. But let's pause here and consider something remarkable. When we carefully examine the biblical text, we find something fascinating and perhaps unsettling. The Bible itself never makes an explicit statement about homosexuality being the specific sin that led to these cities' destruction. This revelation opens up a mystery that has been hiding in plain sight for millennia. Consider the pivotal moment when the angels arrive in Sodom. Yes, the men of the city surround Lot's house, demanding to know the visitors. But this scene, traditionally interpreted purely as sexual aggression, takes on a different dimension when we understand the cultural context of the ancient Near East. In those times, violent treatment of strangers wasn't just about sexual assault. It was a way for cities to assert dominance and send a message to outsiders. You are not welcome here. You have no rights here. The biblical text gives us subtle but crucial clues about the deeper nature of Sodom's sins. In Ezekiel 16:49, page 50, we find a striking indictment. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. This passage, often overlooked in traditional tellings, paints a very different picture of divine judgment. Think about the irony here. A city blessed with abundance, situated on a fertile plain that was well watered like the garden of the Lord, Genesis 13:10, had become a place where wealth bred contempt for the vulnerable. The prophet Isaiah would later compare Israel's corrupt leaders to rulers of Sodom, not for sexual immorality, but for their failure to seek justice and defend the oppressed. Isaiah 1:10-17. The misconception about Sodom and Gomorrah reaches its climax in the dramatic scene of the city's destruction. Traditional interpretations have used this as a cautionary tale about sexual sin, but the evidence suggests something far more complex. The fire and brimstone that rained down weren't simply punishment for one type of transgression. They were the divine response to a complete breakdown of social justice and human dignity. This brings us to a crucial understanding. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't primarily about sexual ethics. It's about how a society treats its most vulnerable members. It's about what happens when prosperity leads to pride, and pride leads to contempt for human dignity. The real sin of Sodom was the sin of dehumanization, treating people as objects to be used and discarded, rather than human beings deserving of dignity and respect. As we peel back these layers of misunderstanding, we begin to see the true depth of this ancient story. But to fully grasp its significance, we need to look even deeper into what the Bible actually tells us about these infamous cities. The evidence we're about to examine will reveal a story far more relevant to our modern world than we might have imagined. Dark Secret: The Social Collapse of Sodom and Gomorrah. Picture a thriving metropolis nestled near the shimmering waters of the Dead Sea. Sodom wasn't just wealthy, it was extraordinarily prosperous, with marketplaces overflowing with exotic goods from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Caravans brought silks, spices, and precious metals through its gates daily. The city's inhabitants dressed in fine linens, lived in elaborate houses, and enjoyed abundance that most ancient civilizations could only dream of. But beneath this glittering surface lurked a darkness that would ultimately lead to the city's destruction. The Bible tells us of a pivotal moment when Abraham, standing before God, received troubling news. "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great," God declared, "and their sin is very grave." But what was this grave sin that reached them? To understand this, we must look at a series of events that unfolded in the weeks before the city's destruction. The book of Ezekiel provides a crucial clue. "Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. She and her daughter had pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy." The story goes deeper. Historical records and biblical scholars have uncovered evidence of a systematic exploitation of the vulnerable. Imagine a beggar arriving at Sodom's gates. Instead of finding shelter, they would be met with cruelty. The Talmud describes how the cities had laws specifically designed to punish acts of charity. One account tells of a young girl who was executed for giving bread to a poor man, a story that highlights the city's institutionalized cruelty. But the corruption went even further. Archaeological evidence suggests that Sodom and Gomorrah were part of a network of 5 cities, each competing to outdo the other in luxury and excess. While their granaries overflowed, they would burn excess food rather than share it with neighboring communities experiencing famine. They created laws that protected the wealthy while criminalizing poverty. The turning point came with the arrival of 2 angels disguised as travelers. Their visit would expose the true depth of Sodom's moral bankruptcy. The city's response to these visitors wasn't just inhospitable, it was violently xenophobic. The entire population, both young and old, all the people from every quarter, surrounded Lot's house, demanding to harm the visitors. This wasn't just about sexual violence. It was the culmination of a society that had completely rejected the fundamental principles of human dignity and hospitality. When we examine the original Hebrew texts, we find something remarkable. The word used to describe Sodom's sin, ra'ah, doesn't simply mean wickedness. It implies a systematic breakdown of social order. The cities hadn't just failed to help the vulnerable, they had created an entire culture that celebrated cruelty and punished compassion. The archaeological record tells us something equally fascinating. The layer of destruction found at the suspected sites of Sodom and Gomorrah shows signs of extreme heat, temperatures that would have been hot enough to turn stone into glass. But more telling are the artifacts found beneath this destruction layer. Luxury items, evidence of feasting, and signs of extreme wealth inequality. These cities weren't destroyed in their poverty, but at the height of their prosperity. As the sun rose on their final day, Sodom and Gomorrah stood proud and wealthy as ever. Their markets were full, their treasuries overflowing. But they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Their sin wasn't any single act, it was the complete rejection of human dignity The institutionalization of cruelty and the fire and brimstone that rained down weren't just punishment. They were the inevitable consequence of a society that had completely lost its moral foundation. But the story of these cities' destruction isn't just a historical account. It's a mirror held up to our own society. As we witness the unfolding of divine judgment on these ancient cities, we must ask ourselves, what parallels can we draw to our modern world? What happens when a society prioritizes wealth over compassion, power over justice? The answers lie in what happened next, as the angels prepared to execute divine judgment. Their story serves as a powerful warning about the true nature of societal sin, not just individual acts of wrongdoing, but the systematic corruption of justice and compassion. As we'll see in the next part of our story, the destruction that followed wasn't just about punishing sin, it was about preventing this moral cancer from spreading to the rest of humanity. Divine visitors, dark intentions, the night that sealed Sodom's fate. Picture, if you will, a bustling evening in ancient Sodom. The sun is setting over the city's imposing walls, casting long shadows across its wealthy streets. This is where our story takes an extraordinary turn, a moment that would forever change the course of biblical history. Two mysterious figures appear at the city gates just as darkness begins to fall. These weren't ordinary travelers, they were angels disguised as men, sent by God on a mission that would reveal the true nature of Sodom's corruption. But only one man in the entire city would recognize the significance of their arrival: Lot, Abraham's nephew. What happened next demonstrates why hospitality wasn't just a courtesy in ancient Near Eastern culture, it was a sacred duty, a test of one's humanity. Lot, sitting at the city gates, a position often held by city elders and judges, immediately rises to greet these strangers. The biblical text tells us he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. This wasn't mere politeness, it was an act of profound respect and recognition. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Lot insists, with almost desperate urgency, that these visitors come to his house. "My lords," he says, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then go on your way early in the morning." His inexplicable insistence seems odd until we understand what he knows about his city's true nature. The visitors initially refuse. "No, we will spend the night in the square." This response is crucial because it sets up a test. In ancient Middle Eastern culture, town squares were traditional places for travelers to rest. Their refusal gives us a glimpse into the divine plan. They're creating an opportunity to reveal Sodom's true character. Lot's persistence becomes increasingly frantic. The text tells us he insisted so strongly that they finally agreed to enter his house. He prepares a feast, bakes fresh bread, and shows them every courtesy, actions that mirror Abraham's own hospitality to divine visitors earlier in Genesis. This parallel isn't accidental. It's meant to show that Lot, despite living in Sodom, maintains the righteous values of his uncle. But then comes the moment that exposes Sodom's utter moral bankruptcy. Before the visitors could retire for the night, every man in Sodom, both young and old, all the people from every quarter of the city, surrounds Lot's house. The biblical text is explicit about their intentions. They demand Lot bring out his visitors so they can know them, a euphemism for sexual assault. This is where we see the true horror of Sodom's sin. It wasn't just about sexual immorality, it was about the complete inversion of hospitality law. Instead of protecting visitors, the entire city mobilizes to violate them. The collective nature of this action is significant. It wasn't just a few corrupt individuals, but an entire society. Lot's response, though troubling to modern readers, reveals the desperate measures he takes to protect his guests. He offers his virgin daughters in place of the visitors, an action that, while morally repugnant to us, demonstrates the extreme lengths he felt compelled to go to uphold the sacred duty of protecting guests. This moment shows both Lot's commitment to hospitality and the impossible moral choices forced upon the righteous in a corrupt society. The angels then reveal their true nature, striking the mob with blindness, a symbolic punishment that reflects their moral blindness. This supernatural intervention confirms the divine nature of these visitors and sets up the dramatic conclusion, the announcement of Sodom's impending destruction. This pivotal episode reveals something profound about the nature of societal corruption. It shows how a civilization can become so morally bankrupt that violence becomes normalized and the protection of the vulnerable is completely abandoned. The angel's visit serves as both test and testimony, a final chance for Sodom to demonstrate any remaining virtue, and when it fails, a clear justification for its destruction. As the night draws to a close and the angels prepare to reveal God's judgment, we must ask ourselves, what does the destruction that follows tell us about divine justice and the consequences of societal moral failure? The answer lies in understanding not just the act of destruction itself, but the profound message it carries for all civilizations that follow. Divine fire, the day heaven rained judgment. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah stands as one of the most dramatic and impactful episodes in biblical history. Picture this: a prosperous morning in the Jordan Valley, the sun rising over two wealthy cities nestled near the Dead Sea. The marketplaces were beginning to buzz with activity, traders setting up their stalls, and citizens going about their usual routines, unaware that this day would be their last. The biblical account paints a vivid scene of what happened next. From the heavens came fire and sulfur, raining down with devastating force. But this wasn't just any ordinary destruction. It was a moment that would echo through millennia, serving as a powerful lesson about the consequences of moral decay. To truly understand the magnitude of this event, we need to look at the archaeological evidence around the Dead Sea region. Scientists have discovered layers of burned debris and ash dating back to approximately 1900 BCE, exactly where these cities were thought to have stood. The destruction was so complete that nothing remained except scorched earth, a testament to the thoroughness of divine judgment. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. In the biblical narrative before the destruction, Abraham had pleaded with God, engaging in a remarkable negotiation. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" he asked, bargaining to spare the cities if even 10 righteous people could be found. This conversation reveals something profound about the nature of divine justice. It's not arbitrary or hasty, but carefully considered and measured. The morning of the destruction, the angels urged Lot and his family to flee. "Escape for your life. Do not look behind you." This warning carries deep symbolic meaning. The instruction not to look back wasn't just about physical survival. It represented the need to completely break free from a corrupted past. When Lot's wife disobeyed and looked back, becoming a pillar of salt, her fate served as a powerful metaphor for the danger of remaining attached to a destructive way of life. The fire and sulfur that rained down weren't just elements of destruction, they were symbols of purification. In ancient times, both fire and sulfur were used in purification rituals. The divine choice of these elements suggests that this wasn't merely punishment, but a cleansing of corruption that had become so deeply rooted that no other remedy remained. Modern geological studies have revealed evidence of a massive explosion in the region, possibly caused by a meteor impact or a natural gas pocket ignition. These findings don't diminish the spiritual significance of the event. Instead, they show how natural phenomena and divine purpose can intertwine in profound ways. The destruction wasn't just about eliminating evil, it was about establishing a precedent. The Bible repeatedly refers back to Sodom and Gomorrah as examples of divine judgment, but also as warnings about the consequences of abandoning justice and compassion. The prophet Ezekiel later wrote that Sodom's sin was that she and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. The completeness of the destruction, leaving nothing but salt and sulfur-laden ground where once stood proud cities, served as a permanent reminder. Even today, the Dead Sea region where these cities once stood remains a harsh, inhospitable environment, as if nature itself remembers the judgment that took place there. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this ancient destruction is how its lessons echo into our present day. As we look at our own societies with their growing inequalities and social injustices, we must ask ourselves, are we repeating the same patterns that led to Sodom and Gomorrah's downfall? What warnings can we take from their destruction that might help us avoid a similar fate? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction isn't just a tale of ancient judgment. It's a mirror held up to our own civilization, challenging us to examine the foundations upon which we're building our future. As we transition to looking at modern parallels, consider this. If divine judgment were to examine our cities today, what would it find? How Sodom's story mirrors our modern world. Picture yourself standing at the gates of ancient Sodom as the sun rises over the Dead Sea Valley. The limestone walls gleam golden in the morning light, their imposing height a testament to the city's wealth and power. The air is thick with the scent of spices and incense wafting from the bustling markets below. This was no ordinary city. This was one of the crown jewels of the ancient world, where caravans from Egypt and Mesopotamia converged, where wealth flowed as freely as the Jordan River itself. The marketplace teems with life as merchants display their exotic wares, fine Egyptian linens, precious stones from distant lands, and aromatic oils that could fetch a king's ransom. The wealthy citizens of Sodom parade through the streets in their finest garments, their fingers adorned with gold rings, their servants trailing behind. But in the narrow alleys behind the grand boulevards, a different story unfolds. Here, in the shadows of opulence, strangers and the poor huddle in doorways. Ignored by passers-by, their pleas for help met with cold indifference or open hostility. This scene bears an unsettling resemblance to our modern world. Just as in ancient Sodom, we see this stark contrast played out in our own cities, from Wall Street to the streets of San Francisco, from London's financial district to the favelas of Rio. The same pattern of wealth and wickedness that the prophets condemned continues to shape our world. Let me share a particularly revealing moment from the biblical narrative that resonates powerfully today. When the angels, disguised as travelers, arrived at Sodom's gates as the sun was setting, they found themselves in a precarious position. The biblical text tells us they intended to spend the night in the city square, a common practice for travelers in ancient times. But Lot, seeing them there, immediately understood their danger. The text describes his urgent insistence that they come to his home instead, for he knew the dark truth about his city's treatment of strangers. This moment mirrors countless scenes in our modern world. Think of refugee families at border crossings, of homeless individuals seeking shelter in wealthy neighborhoods, of immigrants searching for safety and opportunity. Just as Sodom had developed elaborate systems to discourage and punish those who showed kindness to strangers, a fact detailed in ancient rabbinical commentaries, we see modern institutions and laws that sometimes serve to keep the vulnerable at arm's length. The biblical account goes deeper, revealing how Sodom's prosperity had corrupted its very soul. Ezekiel's prophecy offers a scathing analysis that could easily describe many modern societies. Look, this was the iniquity of your sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of food, and abundance of idleness were in her and her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. The prophet's words cut through the centuries, challenging our own society's obsession with wealth and comfort at the expense of social responsibility. Consider the chilling details preserved in ancient Jewish texts about Sodom's legal system. They tell us the city had laws mandating that any citizen who gave food to a poor person would be stripped of their possessions. They even had a special bed for travelers. If the traveler was too short, they would stretch them to fit, If too tall, they would cut them down to size. This grotesque detail serves as a powerful metaphor for how societies can create systems that force people to conform to their twisted standards rather than adapting to meet human needs. Today, we see similar patterns in more subtle but equally destructive ways. Just as Sodom marked outsiders with paint to identify them as unworthy of help, our modern systems often create invisible but equally effective barriers: credit scores that keep people in poverty, zip codes that determine educational opportunities, immigration status that denies basic human rights. The story reaches its climax with divine judgment. But this wasn't merely about punishment. It was the natural conclusion of a society that had rotted from within. The fire and brimstone that rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah weren't just divine weapons. They were metaphors for the inevitable self-destruction of any society that places wealth above wisdom, comfort above compassion. Yet within this dark tale shines a light of hope through the character of Lot. Despite living in a corrupt system, he maintained his moral compass. When faced with a choice between conforming to society's cruel norms or protecting the vulnerable, he chose the latter, even at great personal risk. His story challenges us today. Will we have the courage to stand against systemic injustice, even when it costs us something? The biblical narrative tells us that as Lot fled the doomed cities, he was commanded not to look back. This wasn't just about physical direction, it was a profound statement about the need to completely break from corrupted systems. Today we face similar choices. Will we continue to uphold systems that prioritize profit over people? Or will we dare to envision and create something new and more just? The parallels between ancient Sodom and our modern world serve as both a warning and a call to action. As we've seen through this journey across millennia, the fundamental questions of human society remain surprisingly consistent. How do we treat the vulnerable? What responsibilities come with prosperity? What happens when we allow wealth to blind us to our moral obligations? As we move forward to explore solutions, let's keep these questions at the forefront of our minds. As we conclude this journey through the true story of Sodom and Gomorrah, we face a profound challenge that echoes across millennia. The destruction of these ancient cities wasn't just a historical event, it stands as an eternal warning about the consequences of allowing prosperity to blind us to our moral obligations. Today, standing at this crucial crossroads in human history, we must ask ourselves, are we willing to learn from their fatal mistakes, or are we destined to repeat them? The choice lies in our hands, just as it did in Lot's. Will you be among those who stand for justice in an increasingly indifferent world? I want to hear your thoughts. What parallels do you see between Sodom's story and our modern society? How can we apply these ancient lessons to create positive change in your community? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your perspective might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear. This isn't just about understanding history, it's about shaping our future. What actions will you take today to ensure your community doesn't follow Sodom's path? How will you stand up for justice and compassion in your daily life? Let's start a conversation that matters. Before you go, I want to extend a special invitation. If you found value in exploring the true story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the profound lessons it teaches us, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Here we delve deep into biblical narratives, uncovering hidden meanings that can transform your understanding of Scripture and its relevance to our modern world. Don't forget to activate the notification bell to ensure you never miss our next exploration of biblical mysteries. Each video uncovers new layers of understanding that can change how you view these ancient stories and their modern implications. And if you know someone who would benefit from these insights, someone who's interested in deeper biblical understanding or wrestling with questions about justice and society, share this video with them. The more minds we bring together, the richer our discussion becomes. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery. Remember, understanding history isn't enough. We must act on its lessons. Until next time, let the wisdom of Sodom and Gomorrah inspire you to be an agent of positive change in your world.